So I was actually just on an engagement where we had compromised a low privilege user and we discovered a network share of files in the environment that all users had access to. And it contained every phone recording that had ever been had on a corporate phone device. And that immediately came to mind. I was like, this could absolutely be used to train models, additional models for AI voice cloning lateral movement.
Welcome to another episode of Mandiant's Defender's Advantage podcast. I am your host, Luke McNamara. Joining me today, I have the pleasure of welcoming on Nick Guttilla, a consultant here in Mandiant's Offensive Security Services, as well as Emily Astranova, associate consultant also with the same team. Nick, Emily, great to have you here today.
Thank you for having us.
Yep, glad to be here.
So we were just talking, I think, right before we hit record, the Mandiant Offensive Security Services. These are the artists formerly known as the Red Teamers. I don't want to limit you guys to just doing those things, but maybe we could start at the outset before we get into today's topic with you guys talking a little bit about, what you do and kind of the role of your team. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, high level is that we perform assessments for our customers from the perspective of a malicious actor, and that being one of a goal that's trying to cause them damage, exploit their products, their applications, their infrastructure, harm their customers, customer data, etc. And what our goal is, right, in emulating these actors is to better prepare the customer for those threats, identify gaps or misconfigurations that they may have otherwise gone unnoticed, right? And actually exploited by that threat actor. So we actually used to even be called proactive security, and that's the gist there, right? Is we're being proactive about a lot of these potential threats, and revealing them for the client for the betterment of their posture. Emily, if you want to add some more to that.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation. I think it's been a while since we've had anyone from the red teaming, pen testing, offensive side on. And I think the topic, though, that we're going to talk about today is very timely with some of the things that are in the news. And we're going to approach it, I think, from two different angles. So the topic is around phishing. Nick, this is something that you've been involved in doing some of these engagements specifically around this. And there's a blog that by the time this episode comes out, you will have released on our site. We'll include it in the show notes. But then the other piece, and Emily, this is a blog actually you wrote last summer, I believe, back in July, is also on the topic of phishing, but more specifically the utilization of AI through voice cloning to carry out those sorts of engagements. So we're going to look at this topic, I think, from both of those angles, the application of AI, but then phishing as a general technique, and hopefully what organizations can do to detect and better prepare against this. So maybe, Nick, to start with you, maybe you could just give us a description of like what you would consider within what is considered phishing. What is it? Why do we have a lot of interest around it against kind of testing against this particular threat right now?
Yeah, so first, I want to define the concept of social engineering as a whole. So just quick what that is in simple terms is it's a way to convince a target, an unsuspecting target, or manipulate, right, that person into performing a certain action or divulging information, right? That's high level kind of social engineering. Now, vishing is kind of just one way to do it. There's other ways physically being in front of that person, right? If you're confronting them in person, or maybe through some other technological means of a chat or a text message or an email, things of that nature. But the reason why vishing is so effective, in addition to these other methods, is because in the current work culture and how our landscape is set up, we have so many different mechanisms of communicating with coworkers, and this is even more apparent in large organizations where you might have two individuals that work on completely opposite sides of the world, and they do need a way to communicate. And as a result, though, the kind of face-to-face relationships that you have with these people on a day-to-day basis aren't really the same. You're not really sharing coffee in the morning, talking about your personal lives and getting so close in that manner to everyone. I mean, I'm sure it still exists on a smaller scale of people who work directly next to you, but there are always going to be individuals who do not, right? And what Vishing does is it allows an attacker to take advantage of this current setup and landscape. Of the remote work of contacting remote IT support, right, and everyone getting essentially used to conversing with strangers in essence, right? Like even if it's a coworker, you might not have ever met them before, and that's kind of why vishing becomes so effective. The other reason why it's so such an effective attack vector is there's less control, and we'll talk about the things that organizations can do, but there's less control on for security teams that are hired by organizations on people's personal devices if they're targeted, right? And that kind of vector, and also this vector as a whole has gotten famous from infamous groups such as Scattered Spider, or our threat intelligence team tracks them as UNC3944, and they've utilized vishing as one of their main tactics in many different industries, targeting help desks and individuals. So it's kind of brought to light this vector and kind of why organizations should be taking it as a serious threat.
Yeah, I think of it as a trend. This was actually from last year's M Trends report, not this year's, but something that I think still holds true is this sort of trend of evasion of detection and threat actors looking more creatively for ways to compromise organizations and get into the network that fall outside traditional security detection. So you mentioned like personal devices and the problem of if you have an employee who gets an info stealer on their personal device that they're also using for corporate work, that activity, everything I just described there, is taking place outside typically the security organization's visibility. And so vishing obviously being another technique that, while phishing itself, traditional email-based phishing, has been a threat for quite some time. There's processes around it, there's technologies to detect and prevent it, there's training. Vishing, I think, seems to be a newer technique that, while not dominant yet compared to some of these other things, is something that we are seeing more and more. You mentioned Scattered Spider back in the news being, one sort of threat actor that has taken advantage of this.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, vishing is also a very intimate form of interaction with the target, right? When you're on the phone with somebody and speaking, and there's intonation of your voice, there's sort of more of a believableness, essentially, of the person's character, of their story, how they present themselves. It's very different from, say, an email or a text message where it's just a face value kind of item. There's nothing behind it, right? Whereas when you're on the phone with somebody, it becomes a little more convincing, and that this may be real, that they're contacting me directly in this manner, right?
Describe a little bit about, okay, so you're going into a red team engagement, pen testing engagement, and you're specifically going to employ this as a technique. Is this something that you scope with the customer beforehand and they say, okay, I would like for you to employ this as a technique? And then what does that kind of look like as you are planning out the engagement, kind of the preparatory stage?
Yeah, so I'd say all of our assessments, for the most part, are tailored to a customer's needs. They can get even more specific the more iterations that we work with maybe the same client or clients that have a lot of experience in testing in general, and they want us to look at specific things. But really, what it comes down to is the scope of work. So if it's purely a social engineering project, we might define what we're social engineering. If it's employees, if well, standard employees versus IT employees or a call center, and then we'll define what's in scope for that. If it's both, or again, as we kind of were talking about, a full scale red team, and quick explanation of that being kind of the full gambit of an attack vector through externally facing infrastructure to internally facing infrastructure, and then utilizing information gathered throughout the process to employ that with social engineering. So breaching a perimeter, gaining access to internal information, and using that internal information that you might have otherwise not have had to better prepare the context or pretext for your voice campaigns, right? So if you're able to gain information on technologies that are used, on conversations or issues that are existing, IT support channels, things of that nature, that maybe somebody who only is an employee would know, that can all better validate your pretext and how you approach social engineering. So overall, it comes down to what the client wants, and we basically want to give them the best emulation of what a real threat actor would do within the realm of what is what is legal for us, right?
So I would imagine that a lot of this would be at the initial access stage, where you'd be leveraging this particular technique. Although, Emily, in your blog, we'll get to this in a second, but you noted, I think, some of the use cases where this certainly could be leveraged through other parts of the attack lifecycle. But maybe, going to kind of where, let's say you already have kind of scoped out what this engagement is going to look like. How might you approach? Kind of walk us through some of the ways that you would employ vishing as part of that.
From the perspective of already being inside. Now, as I mentioned, you would try sourcing internal data, right? If we're talking about Active Directory, that might be user account profiles, and any kind of data that is part of that. So we're talking employee identification numbers, teams that they're part of, group memberships, ownership over specific things, right? And then as well as coworkers and hierarchical structures, who's their manager, and all this information gathered to better present yourself if you're impersonating that employee to, say, an IT help desk where they might need any of the above information to validate you. Aside from that, if you're compromised a user's account already, you can converse over chat channels or phone calls through those means where you have access to that person's account, and the person on the recipienting end, if they've never had a direct conversation with that person before, they might not be familiar with your voice in general. And because you're coming from a legitimate corporate account, they have no reason to otherwise believe that you really aren't that individual. Now, when we talk about, you mentioned the life cycle or just kind of thought process of how an attacker is operating through an organization, you're thinking of, okay, we're past the initial access point, but now how can we perform lateral movement? How can we do privilege escalation and maintain persistence, right? And then actually do our damage or exfiltrate our confidential data, what have you. Sometimes when you're inside, you might have compromised that of a low privileged user. But from that low privileged user, you could obtain information on a higher privileged user that you wouldn't have been able to source externally, right? Because now you're on the inside, you have access to this internal information, and then kind of cyclically go through that process. You call in to a help desk, you see how they're trying to identify this person, and maybe you can't get so far as to reset both a password and their MFA. But if you're already inside, sometimes maybe just the password's enough, right? And they might have internal policies that maybe when you're in the inside, they don't require MFA. And just getting that password is enough. And again, cyclically going through that process. Now you this new user, what do they have access to? How can I better prepare another campaign where I call a help desk, or maybe they're a manager and I call the employees below them, things like that. Emily, you want to add some more to that?
Yeah, so I can actually talk about the red team that I'm on currently. So we started this red team last week, and like you said, this is all very tailored, depending on what the client wants. So we discussed all this up front with them first, and it's a full red team. So we were still required to do all of our open source intelligence gathering, all of our pre-text creation, payload generation, all of that. And so essentially, the way that it went was through our open source intelligence gathering, we discovered some DNS records for SSO for TeamViewer, which means that they were using TeamViewer Enterprise, at least at some point. We also enumerated employee information, mostly things like LinkedIn, and we actually sorted them by hire date to try and find some of the newest members that had been hired at this company. So the way that the pretext worked was we called up this individual. We were actually spoofing the phone number of their IT person, and we coincidentally had picked a target that A was super new, but the person that we were stealing the phone number and identity of was remote, and no one had ever seen or heard this individual. A lot of their communication is written and over Teams and the such. So we called her and we told her like, hey, we're having some issues on our end trying to log into your computer to install a patch through TeamViewer. So rather than immediately asking for her to log into the attacker portal or anything like that, we were just asking, can you please just see if TeamViewer opens? She verified with us that TeamViewer is opening, but it, again, kind of coincidence here, through an error. So we're like, yeah, that's probably the issue. So we had her navigate to an attacker hour controlled portal where we had her put in credentials for O365. We stole those, stole her session, and then we passed her on to actually downloading our payload. And we got C2 checking that way. And like you said, and as we expected, this was a very low privilege user. So even once we're in the environment, we've actually got our callbacks and we're in control of a host and a user. Not a ton that we could do there. We did some enumeration of what was possible, and through some ADCS misconfigurations, we actually escalated from that low privilege user to their domain admin in the first day.
So again, this is something obviously useful for initial access, but then also to kind of have that foothold that you build into the rest of the environment to move laterally. When you employ it, and again, maybe this is based on sort of what the organization is looking for and how you tailor the engagement, but are you typically using this, would you say more at the initial access stage than lateral movement? Is it kind of both? Do you do engagements where you try to do no malware at all, just phishing, social engineering, capturing credentials and trying to move that way? I'm trying to get a sense of kind of how this fits in with some of the other techniques that as red teamers, pen testers, you could employ in targeting an organization.
So to answer the question on where we use it, right? I would say it definitely depends on where you're at the project. So let's say you do get an email phish and you're able to get a payload, or again, you could voice phish for initial access. It doesn't necessarily mean that voice phishing stops there, right? I can give you an example from a project where we had gotten in to a user's account through an email phish, and it was a standard user. They didn't have any administrative access at all by any means. But what they did have access to was their chat application that they used to converse with coworkers, but also an IT channel where users would post issues that they had that we were currently facing. Using this standard employee that had access to this IT channel, we kind of monitored for anyone with existing issues. And once we saw a real IT person give them a thumbs up on their issue, we followed up on their profile, see if we can get their direct phone number that was linked to their profile, and then called those users individually, knowing their real IT issue, and basically saying, hey, we're here to help. And we utilize this as a method of lateral movement from the initial user we compromised to additional users in the network, right? And kind of, again, everything is cyclical. So once we get to that next user, okay, now what do they have? When it comes to more of a direct privilege escalation example versus a lateral movement, I really wanted to stress, I guess, and I do a lot in the post, is the identification process and how IT may be validating who on the phone actually is who they say they are. But also, what are the controls around how employees are registering things like phone number, MFA, and things of that nature? And I had an instance where we were able to exploit a flawed identification process at the business where they didn't require sufficient information or what we would consider sufficient to validate the employee. And as a result, we were able to change a high level user's password through calling into the help desk. But even though we didn't have the ability at this point to reset MFA, we found an application that was single factor at the time because the real employee had never logged into it before. And because we were able to log into it, it wanted us to set up MFA. MFA was never set up, and we were able to register our own MFA device. So this allowed us from simply calling with, again, from a standard user having enough information on our target employee after breaching the perimeter, we're able to convince the call center to reset the password, and then set a new factor of MFA for this employee on an application that gave us administrative rights.
One of the things I was thinking hearing you talk about that is you really get a sense of, I guess, how an adversary could exploit identity and kind of the sort of structure around privilege and how identity works within a larger environment and how privilege is associated with that, how even things like multi-factor authentication may or may not be enforced on certain applications. So when you think about that whole kind of chain of privilege or the sort of decision tree, as you're moving through the network or accessing or trying to access different informations, you're essentially looking for ways that you can kind of break or exploit that identity chain.
Yeah, and in this particular example, we actually almost got so far as for them to provision us a virtual machine to this person's account, so that we would be able to operate from a separate workstation from the actual hardware that they were provided. So definitely had this customer going through their identification process and essentially revamping that to account for this kind of issue.
So I think people should have a sense now at this point that this is a very powerful technique, both for initial access, lateral movement, other parts of the attack lifecycle. I want to pivot to this blog, Emily, that you wrote. Whose voice is it anyway? Because this takes this concept of vishing and the utility in compromising an organization by employing it, but it adds on the component of AI and it adds on the point of component of voice cloning. And I think it's a really fascinating blog. Again, both these blogs will include linked in the show notes here. But as we think about what new techniques we could see from threat actors and leveraging generative AI, to me, this is, I think, one of the most powerful examples I've seen where you essentially did a proof of concept that this technique could be employed, leveraging AI and doing this type of activity that we've been talking about. So maybe walk us through this kind of project that you did and what you were setting out to achieve.
Yeah, so initially we didn't really set out with the explicit goal of like we're going to use AI vishing for X, Y, or Z. We actually had a client that presented us with a really challenging vishing scenario where they wanted us to vish someone on their security team. The individual that they wanted us to vish was actually really good friends with our point of contact that we had been running the engagement with. So, this would be considered a spear vishing. Vishing one specific person who, we were going to impersonate our point of contact, doing that where there's already some sort of pre-established trust was a really difficult thing to do. He knows what he sounds like and things like that. I had seen some of these open source voice models being used for other things, and I thought, how hard could this actually be to use as a red teamer? So we actually got permission from our point of contact to record their voice, train a model on it, and call this security team member impersonating our point of contact. So we did this with the AI model that we trained, and additionally to that, we spoofed our point of contact's phone number. I clearly remember when the individual answered the phone with "Hey, boss," and that like immediately put me into character. The pretext that we had had for that was they were experiencing some VPN outages. So we called as the security admin's boss saying, "Hey, I think we've got a temporary VPN client patch that we can test out to kind of get around this. We don't want to roll it out to everyone without testing it. Could I have you try and execute this for me?" We had the security staff member navigate to our browser in the middle framework where we harvested credentials from them, had them download this fake VPN patch, and they had actually had some initial troubles running it. And we had to walk them through bypassing like the smart screen prompts and some mark of the web stuff. And I mean, throughout the whole call, just no suspicion at all that this was AI in any way. All this is real time. I'm on the other end of the call. And sure enough, we got our payload deployed, and rest is history. We've been doing that regularly for clients ever since.
I was going to ask you, was this prior to you mentioned this story in the blog, but the now infamous Hong Kong, essentially, I think it was like a BEC type incident. But was this prior to that event where you're like, oh, you saw that and you're like, okay, could we emulate that, or was this after that had been kind of talked about as a technique?
I believe that this was just before the Hong Kong incident. I want to say that happened in February, and we had done this in December. So, we did our engagement. I was in the middle of writing the blog post, and then the Hong Kong incident happened. I was like, this is about to get really big.
And how much data did it require to train the voice model? I mean, in terms of roughly like, number of hours of recordings to emulate this individual's voice?
Yeah, so actually, that's one of the things that kind of surprised me about this attack vector is we only needed 10 minutes of audio data. And I mean, this is just audio data through a normal microphone during a meeting. 10 minutes of audio data and several hours of training was enough to create a really convincing voice model.
And then I think one of the things that what stood out to me that I found interesting about that, and it gets kind of back to what we were talking about earlier about using vishing both as initial access but also lateral movement is I can't remember if you use this in the engagement or just mention the feasibility of it, but being able to gain once you're inside the environment, you find recordings of a Teams call. You have now recordings of an individual who's internal. And so you think it's obviously easier if you have, someone's executive, their CEO is on Bloomberg or financial media. There's tons of recordings out there, although it sounds like you don't need much. But what if you have an admin you don't have public recordings of, but now you can gain access to an environment and you find their voice on a call, a conference call internally, and then you can train that model again and continue carrying out this technique.
So I was actually just on an engagement where we had compromised a low privilege user and we discovered a network share of files in the environment that all users had access to. And it contained every phone recording that had ever been had on a corporate phone device. And that immediately came to mind. I was like, this could absolutely be used to train models, additional models for AI voice cloning lateral movement.
So, given that you have a lot of different skill sets in your toolbox when you're thinking about approaching compromising an organization, escalating privileges, moving laterally, doing the entire life cycle, and that this is now one that I think, in particular, you guys have been leveraging. How do you think about the utility of it? So there's certainly a feasibility that I think you've shown and demonstrated, but is this something that, absent any customer direction, is it something that you would use sparingly? Is it something that you do find pretty effective in specific use cases? I don't know if that makes sense, but in terms of utility of a technique, how do you find that it's played out in some of these engagements?
So, without any client guidance, it's certainly harder. We have to lean on our open source intelligence that we're able to gather. I was actually on a AI voice cloning engagement where the client wouldn't give us any kind of data that would help us with our engagement, including any of the voice data. The person they wanted us to impersonate was actually the I believe the CISO of their company. They had given talks, plenty of talks, and we were able to create a voice model of them just from data on YouTube. That takes several hours, and through that, we were actually able to get initial access by doing that, finding out the individuals that directly worked for that person, and giving them a phone call and saying that I believe that pretext was there was an urgent need for X, Y, or Z, and it needed to be done now. And the individual actually panicked, and I had not realized that they weren't at work that day. They had actually had the day off, but they opened up their laptop, quickly logged on, and they tested. I think it was some kind of firewall isn't working pretext, or that it was blocking something I absolutely needed to get to, and we were able to get a payload that way. So certainly harder, but I think still a really valid utility to have.
And I think it's an interesting question when you think about looking forward. This as a technique, both of vishing, I would say, writ large, but then also using voice cloning for it, where you're trying to emulate a specific person's voice. It will be interesting to see how prolific of a technique this will be leveraged by threat actors. I think certainly there are going to be, there already are threat actors that are doing this, but is this something that is going to become more widespread? And so maybe kind of tying all this together for both of you, you've both done a lot of engagements that have involved vishing, either voice cloning or not. What have been some of the things that have thwarted you? What have been some of the things that, if you were to say, okay, if you're an organization, you hear all this, it sounds very scary, that they should be kind of focused on in terms of putting things in place from a policy standpoint, detection standpoint, maybe? What are some of the advice you would give on the defensive side that would make your guys' jobs harder?
Yeah, so I would start out by saying, admittingly, every organization is different, right? There's different reasons why there are certain controls in place, maybe more lenient in certain cases versus others. And that's one of those things where when we're working with a customer, you get on more of that intimate level where they can kind of explain to us, okay, this is why we have this the way it is. But for kind of like general best practices that every organization can try to apply and stuff that stopped me directly is the biggest one, enforcement of MFA as a whole, right? So even if we're able to convince for a password reset for externally facing infrastructure, if you have enforced MFA and proper conditional access policies that don't get around MFA in any way, that would prevent further exploitation of an account, right, where you can get a password reset. Now, when it comes to the resetting of other items, such as MFA directly, or even, let's say, a factor that's used to identify a person. Let's say they verify you via text message and it goes to a specific phone number or an email, right? To prevent resetting of any sort of verification procedure, one of the biggest things that has stopped me, and I recommend it to all my clients, is getting that individual's manager involved directly for that process, or have that individual come on a phone call, video chat, whether it be Google Meet, Teams, Zoom, any application that that organization utilizes, and verify them with a either government issued ID or employee ID. And for past resets, MFA resets, or any kind of reset, additionally CC the manager when that happens. So make sure that they're aware. You get that third party involvement in that change. This way, if the real employee is affected, they'll know immediately as well, and you can kind of close down on any sort of issue. Now, for MFA, that's going to vary again, client to client, who's allowed to have what kind of MFA, how expensive is it going to be if you want to provide everybody with physical MFA versus kind of an application on your phone, if you're allowed to put an application on that user's phone, all kinds of things like that. But that has been alone one of the best technical controls. Now, in addition to that, some common attacks that we would do is we try to reset the MFA first and then go for the MFA for the password reset. So other kind of techniques is utilizing your ticketing systems for kind of more of alerts around, okay, was there a password reset and then an MFA reset, or an MFA reset and then a password reset, and kind of drawing some correlation between these changes in the environment that should raise a lot of flags by security. Hey, why are we fully changing this person's account on such short notice? And then again, it always comes back to, and why this attack vector is successful is you're preying on the individual, whereas it's a less technical control. You can't really have full control over a person, but you can train them to identify suspicious activity, to reach out through other means to verify that the person you're talking to really is that person. And if you can't verify them, again, their manager or another individual who could do that on their behalf. That would be like kind of a general recommendation that I would say.
Yeah, and just to hop in, something that stopped me plenty of times, and this all comes down to employee training, is as attackers, we can spoof the phone number that's showing up on your phone when we call. But if you call back, of course, it's going to go to the actual intended individual, not back to us, the attacker. So as a victim receiving a call where something very urgent is being asked of you, or maybe if something's too good to be true, a very simple way to kind of avoid a situation like this is to say, hey, can I call you back real quick? And that call is going to go back to the legitimate person that we were impersonating. The same thing kind of goes for email. You know, if we hijack an email relay, we might be able to send you a message, but if you respond to it, it is going to go to the person, the genuine, legitimate person. So those are really easy ways to, just kind of work that into your employee training. Other things that I've seen are if there's any kind of suspicion that maybe communication as a whole has been breached, having a dedicated out of band communication that everyone is aware of to use ahead of time, of course, not post breach, ideally. And then for AI specific recommendations, as this gets more prolific, I've even seen organizations start to use, as ridiculous as it sounds, code words that rotate on a daily basis, for your high ranking executives, for your people that are able to make very damaging changes to your organization.
Yeah, I've certainly heard that become more common as well. Sort of again, the concept of putting additional security around people with more privilege, or ones you want to secure more closely. I'm curious, as we close here, any thoughts on where, as a technique, we're going to see this go? Again, on the adversary side, whether it is just normal vishing or AI enabled, is this something that you think we're going to see more of as some of these other avenues to compromise organizations maybe become more secure? I mean, we continue to see phishing drop, I think, year over year in M trends. I think that probably in part is pointed to better detections and processes to prevent that as an avenue. But is this something that you think we're going to see more and more of?
Yeah, I'd say for sure. I don't think fishing as a whole is going away anytime soon, especially the more we rely on all of these different methods of remote interaction, right? It's par for the course of how a lot of these technologies even work. Now, again, there's all of these strategies you could put into play and processes that you can really refine to better protect the organization. But as mentioned earlier in our talk, there's the whole realm of the personal device and the personal computer and that world that a company really doesn't have a lot of direct control over. And it's just it's a path for attack. Now, in addition to voice, I know even the video AI has been getting a lot better. And I've heard tons of stories of fake even Zoom calls, right, or fake Teams calls or video where they try to utilize AI to not only impersonate a person's voice, but the way they look. I think that all of these are kind of innovations for the future from an attack perspective. But at the same token, in time, you can utilize AI maybe to better identify the real people and kind of have alerts in that respect. Maybe you have voice recordings of your employees where AI can compare them to someone trying to impersonate it and things of that nature. I think there's a lot of innovation on the defensive side as well, where you can utilize AI in that way. To say that the attack vector would be going away, I don't think would be true.
Yeah, it's like I said earlier, it was kind of shocking to me how low the barrier to entry for this attack vector already is. I mean, you've got people using this in video games just to sound like celebrities or like characters from TV shows that people like. I've seen people impersonating YouTubers, people making fake videos of US presidents. So this is all being done on consumer hardware with open source models. The barrier to entry is already super low for voice, at least. I don't see why that trend wouldn't continue and video starts to become more accessible as well. As a matter of fact, I think the FBI just released a notice a few days ago that they're starting to see people impersonate senior U.S. officials. And I know I've seen a few more reports about this happening more in the financial sector.
Well, that's certainly a anytime you're covering some of the cyber trends, especially in the cutting edge, some of the scarier content to talk about. But I think hopefully folks get a sense of, I think, the creativity with which your team in the Mandiant Offensive Security Services approaches this. And I think doing these sorts of engagements that you do for customers really does help them kind of harden and increase the prevention of these potential threats. So thank you both for sharing your insights today. We'll have to have you back on again sometime soon and see how the landscape has progressed around this particular trend. I think it is really fascinating, as scary as it is, but a lot of good insights here. So Nick, Emily, thank you both for joining today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.